Thank you so much for coming, and thank you for coming, especially today when we have a distinguished speaker. Sam will chair the session. Of course, you all know him. He will also introduce our guest today. There will be ample time for Q&A. And let me just reiterate that we're sorry about the confusion with the starting time. If you kind of got, different messages. This is not what usually happens at the lecture series. It's just this time. So apologies for people who showed up early. I hope you can stay with us till the end. But if not, we of course also understand. So Sam, please.
Thanks, Kata. Thanks for arranging this. When Matthew wrote and said, "I've got this new book out. What do you think?" and the lecture series had finished, but Kata jumped on it straight away and said, "No, let's definitely have another one around this book." So I'm Sam Hickey, the head of the Global Development Institute. I'm lucky I met Matthew. I was going through emails actually. It was over 10 years ago, 2015, when I interviewed you for the project, around about then. And Matthew's we couldn't have anyone better here to talk about this subject. When I met Matthew, he was working in the key social protection team within the Department for International Development that was involved in making sure that social protection became a global story. There's still massive inequalities within that in terms of who gets protected in the world, as Matthew will go into talk about. Despite it being one of the key things that we share as humans, we're all vulnerable. Everyone needs protection at some stage of the life cycle and in relation to economic shocks, but coverage remains highly unequal. And Matthew is a key part of the push to globalise the protection of vulnerable people. I think you might have been headhunted into that team. I'm trying to remember what happened, because you were previously working in social security, not in the global south, but in this country up until about 2003. Gets across into a team within DFID, which is then swiftly becomes led by someone who is a missionary for social protection, who goes on to expand it massively and make sure that DFID is a key player in doing battle with the World Bank on which countries should get social protection in what form. So we're going to get some of that story. And then Matthew, after his period at DFID, went on to work with Development Pathways, which is a key NGO that's been promoting social protection, but also working with people, delivering it and making sure it gets delivered in the right ways. So delighted to have you here. It's really looking forward to the talk. Thanks for the book, and I look forward to reading through it in more depth, but I haven't got there yet, so I'm really looking forward to what you come up with. So around about 40 minutes, and then we'll open up for Q&A. But let's welcome Matthew.
Hi everyone. It's a great pleasure to be here, to be in Manchester. My first time in Manchester properly. It's an honour to be speaking at this university. Thank you to Sam and Kata and to the Global Development Institute for inviting me. My name is Matthew Greenslade. I'm an economist. I've worked on social protection for more than 25 years. As Sam said, first as a government official in the UK government, working on social security, the benefit system in the UK, then in the Department for International Development, and independently since I left there in 2016, including with this organisation, Development Pathways. I'm going to talk, as Sam said, for about 40 minutes, and then we can have a discussion and Q&A. I'm going to talk about why I wrote this book and how, what it's about, why I think the World Bank does what it does, and possible ways forward. So, why did I write this book? Because of a series of emotions, really. Well, I wanted to open a world which I think is largely hidden. It was from concern about an issue that affects the lives of millions, hundreds of millions of people around the world. Anger was another emotion, frankly, at a lot of the things the World Bank has done and that I've observed myself. Shock at the lack of critical thinking within the World Bank, and the lack of learning in terms of what is done within countries, and admiration for the people involved in the fight, the global fight for universal social protection. But this, I just want to say that this isn't a personal go at individual staff within the World Bank. I was talking to Shamik about this before we started, who worked in the World Bank on the research side, I think you said, right? Which tends to be a little more progressive, I think, it's right to say. I worked in DFID for many years. DFID supported the sorts of programs that I'm critiquing the World Bank for. So it's an institutional critique and not a personal one. How I wrote the book, well, drawing on my own experience working in a number of countries, documentation obviously, and interviewing people within countries, working within countries, people that are part of the fight for universal social protection, but not World Bank people, which they've already complained about, I know. I can come on to I can explain the whys and wherefores of that if there's interest. What is the book about? It's a human story on the global battle to stand up to the World Bank and introduce universal social protection. But can I just ask, actually, I mean, who is familiar, how many people here are familiar with social protection as a concept? Can you put your hands up if you are familiar? So that looks like half-ish, just under half. I mean, it's a phrase I don't particularly like, social protection. I don't really know how it became sort of part of the dialogue. By social protection, I mean social security, as we call it in the UK. It's the benefit system. It's child benefits, disability benefits, pensions, things like that, and no more. Different organisations define it as different things, and it can go wider and wider and wider. But I am, by social protection, I mean the social security system. Now, I've written a human story, so it's readable, hopefully. And the story focuses on someone called Stephen Kidd, who Sam referred to. He was head of the social protection team in DFID for a number of years. I've worked with him for ages. Why have I told his story? Well, because he's been at the forefront of the battle, what I'm calling the battle, or the fight for universal social protection for a couple of decades. And his is a story I can tell. He was happy to be interviewed. He lives not that far from me. We've worked together in DFID and outside DFID. So that means I'm looking through one particular lens. But it's a lens that I hope throws light on much wider arguments and on a much wider global coalition that includes NGOs, activists, academics, many UN staff, led by far the most important actors in all of this, which is representative governments themselves. It's a global coalition for universal social protection, and this book is really a tribute to that coalition. And it's intended to entertain but also give hope, because social protection, as many of you will know, has wide effects on health and education and food security and reducing domestic violence and macroeconomic effects, climate crisis related and beyond that. And I think history shows all successful countries have invested in protecting their people, in social policy, including social protection. You know, I think standing back and looking at world history, it's really a sort of triumph of humanity. All we seem to hear at the moment is problems, and this is one of the answers. So it's intended to be a story of hope and of successes, and this is a very important moment in history, according to UN research, because lower income countries are about the same income level in terms of GDP per capita as rich countries were when they started introducing the building blocks of their more comprehensive social protection systems. But the book argues that the World Bank is distorting the picture, because with few exceptions, it promotes a certain type of social protection program, which is poverty-targeted social protection, as well as things called conditional cash transfers and poverty-targeted public works programs, and we can get more into those if there's interest. Now, social protection systems or social security systems are made up of two sides. One is the government financed side, where government pays for benefits through its tax revenues, income tax, corporation tax, etc. And the other side is benefits that are contributory, like contributory pensions. Now, the focus of this talk is the government finance, the tax finance side. Both sides are very important. The contributory side tends to be restricted by the size of the formal labour market, and in lower income countries the formal part of the labour market tends to be the minority of it. So if there's going to be universal social protection, a lot of the heavy lifting is going to have to be done by the government financed side. So it is the World Bank's promotion of poverty targeted on the government financed benefit side that the book is focused on. Now, poverty targeting has intuitive appeal. Of course, resources are always limited. Why not direct them at those that need them most? The problem is poverty targeting is very hard to do. It's hard to do in a UK context. As mentioned, I worked in the Department of Work and Pensions here in the UK, and saw for myself it's hard enough to do in a high income setting where there's lots of documentation, and the vast majority work in the formal labour market. If you transfer to northern Kenya or southern Malawi or somewhere like that, in an environment where people are working outside of the formal labour market, in an environment where everyone, by any sort of reasonable measure, is poor, and where people have similarly low levels of income, and income levels which can change quite a lot from one period to the next, on a scale of sort of easy to impossible, you're moving towards the impossible end in terms of poverty targeting effectively. One of the costs of trying to do this is high targeting error. According to one piece of research, in most poverty targeted programs in lower income countries, over half of those properly eligible for benefits are excluded from benefits, do not receive those benefits. So you think about that. You imagine being in a vulnerable household where there's a 50% chance you are not going to get the support that you are eligible for. There are huge issues in these programs about lack of transparency, about human rights and human dignity. We see community discord often as a direct result of these programs in many countries. We even see communities sometimes fighting back by redistributing benefits more equally as they see it. Other costs to these programs, possible lack of political support, lack of government investment. I can go through examples of that. This is a point that's constantly argued over with the World Bank, but we do see that in instances, and poverty targeting costs more to do. A higher proportion of programs will be spent on administration doing poverty targeting because it's more complicated. Now, the alternative model is universal benefits, which go to categories in the population often determined by age, sometimes disability, but where income isn't a factor. So it just go to everyone, regardless of income within the particular category. Now, other things being equal, these programs will cost more because benefits are going to more people, but they can also produce benefits. They can be more unifying, they can potentially strengthen the social contract, the deal between citizens and government. We pay taxes, you give us decent services in return. And arguably, they help to stabilise Western Europe post-Second World War. They've played a role in strengthening the social contract in countries like Mauritius and Nepal. They can bring about social peace that can underpin national development and growth, which is the key determinant, as we know, of sustained poverty reduction in the long term. So we're faced with a situation where for both design choices, poverty targeting and universality, there are costs and benefits. And the simple contention of the book is it is up to governments themselves and the people that vote for those governments and local civil society organisations as part of that local debate to determine the best way forward. It's not up to outside actors. I'm not saying you should never have poverty targeted schemes. I'm not saying they should always be universal. I mean, I have no right to say what should happen within countries. I'm saying that the World Bank should not exclude universal programs from the outset, as they too often do. What happens in reality without donor interference? Well, governments with reasonably developed systems typically choose a mix of poverty targeting and universality, and that's certainly what happens in the UK. So it's wrong for the World Bank to relentlessly pursue to promote poverty targeting as it does, using the leverage of the large resources at its disposal. Now this is a debate that's gone on for years, if not decades, and yet the World Bank shows no sign of shifting its position whatsoever. In fact, I was saying to Sam earlier, I think that the position is strengthening, if anything. I mean, a publication from the World Bank last year, State Social Protection Report 2025, to quote from it, it said, tax finance social protection should be focused on those in the poorer quintiles, especially in lower middle income countries where fiscal resources are limited and needs are high. So that's an unambiguous line. And now the World Bank promotes something called social registries. I don't know how many of you are familiar with social registries, but they're basically databases that allow you to poverty target across a range of benefits, not just one. And to give you a sort of flavour of the scale of the World Bank's promotion of social registries, picking sub-Saharan Africa in this case, I just want to quote from the book. Kate O'Donnell, a PhD student at the International Institute of Social Studies at Erasmus University in Rotterdam, is researching the development of social registries in sub-Saharan Africa. She says between 2010 and 2024, 46 countries in sub-Saharan Africa agreed a social protection loan with the World Bank. In all of these loans, just to emphasise, in all of these loans, reference is made either to plans to develop a social registry or to a social registry that is already under development. Martin Ravalian was head of research at the World Bank until he left in 2012. After, sadly no longer with us, after he left, he described the World Bank's line on promotion of poverty targeting social protection program as a fetish, little more than a fetish. Now often, so that's the argument in the book. Often a couple of points are made in response to the argument I'm making in the book. One point that's often made is, well, all very well, but financial constraints and rising debt currently mean you've just got to focus on the poorest, you haven't got any choice. Well, my answer to that is no. Financial constraints are always a reality wherever you are at any point in time. And we must always work within them. Government debt must always be on a sustainable path. Macroeconomic stability is always very important. But that's not an excuse to make bad decisions. Now remember all those costs I talked about with poverty targeting, high targeting error, community discord, etc., and lack of political support. And the potential benefits of a more universal approach, the potential strengthening of the social contract. Now that can lead, the strengthening of the social contract, to collecting more in tax revenue. It can be a positive process, a virtuous circle or cycle. Now that's a dynamic process that must be allowed to play out and must not be cut across by external actors. Now that process of strengthening the social contract and getting a consequent increase in tax revenue, there's highly suggestive evidence from Nepal that it's happening there. Universal benefits were introduced when Nepal was squarely a low-income country in the mid-90s, the beginning of the Civil War actually, and delivered through the Civil War, believe it or not, and was strengthened and expanded by the Maoist government that came after. There's cross-party support. Tax revenue as a proportion of GDP in Nepal has, I think it's more or less doubled in the last 30 years, at a time when it's been flat in sort of big countries around like Bangladesh and India. Now this is national development, it's huge and complicated, it's hard to be conclusive, but the evidence there is suggestive. And remember, we only need the possibility of universal programs developing a positive dynamic for the World Bank's position, very dogmatic position in promoting poverty targeted programs to be wrong. But too often we hear lack of resources, it's a very sort of static picture, equals you've got poverty targeted programs to get short-term reductions in poverty. I.e., frankly, you've got to have this donor designed crappy program, can I put it like that? I mean, it's a nonsense, really. I mean, going back to the point I was making about lower income countries being at about the same income level as richer countries, when they started putting in place the building blocks of their more comprehensive systems. Finland was poorer than Jordan is now when it started putting in place universal social policy. Yet Jordan is a country where, as is described in the book, where the World Bank has pushed and pushed and pushed for the government to adopt its brand of poverty targeting. And then, as you can read in the book, COVID hit, so the government needed money more than it did before, so it accepted the World Bank loan, $350 million or whatever it was, and the condition of that loan was that poverty targeting, World Bank's brand of poverty targeting, has to be introduced to Jordan. So it's a complete nonsense. Another point that's often made against the argument set out in the book is surely poverty targeting is better than nothing. It's all we can do in the circumstances. And again, I'd say no to that, because what happens is introducing things like social registries, building the institutions so you can do these poverty targeted programs, pulls resources and government staff time in another direction. And then you get path dependency. You were doing it last year, so you carry on doing it this year. The poverty targeted program isn't working, but it's it's what we've got, so let's try and improve it. And I think that can cause delays in building sustainable, comprehensive social protection systems. I think it can introduce delays for years, if not decades. The Hunger Safety Net programme in Ethiopia is a poverty-targeted social protection programme. It's been around for over 20 years. Last I heard, it's still basically funded by donors. I think it was 15% government finance last time I looked. There are similar stories in Malawi and Tanzania. Now, I don't see programs being put in place in these countries that are going to be there in 50 years' time unless they're still funded by donors. I think we're talking about two fundamentally different mindsets. One is social protection as a sort of residual poverty-targeted mop-up thing for those that aren't, that lose in terms of the economy and economic engagement. Another is a much more comprehensive preventative system for the population as a whole, the Sam was describing at the outset. Life cycle system based on entitlement, not giving out to those in need, a sort of charity model, if you like. One example I was talking about with Sam when we were talking before is Kenya, where I've worked quite a lot, where the government, learning from what happened in Zanzibar, where a universal pension was introduced in 2016. Zanzibar learned from Mauritius, which introduced a universal pension. I think it was in the late 50s. World Bank, of course, opposed both, still opposing the universal pension in Mauritius, even all these years later. Kenya learned from Zanzibar and introduced its own universal pension in 2018. What did donors there do? I'm thinking of the World Bank and DFID, which I work for. They opposed the universal pension. They were angry about it because they'd been collaborating with the government on poverty-targeted programs for a number of years. I was telling Sam, I even heard one donor member of staff describe the universal pension as a pain because it took government officials away from working on their precious donor programs. Programs which were being co-financed by governments, but nevertheless programs that are never going to be building blocks in comprehensive social protection programs with proper national coverage, such as richer countries have. I was absolutely shocked by donor behaviour. Donors the universal pension has run into some problems, in part because of a lack of donor support. It's not to do with what can be afforded, because donors are ploughing enough money into poverty-targeted benefits to finance the universal pension for a number of years. But I was really shocked by the lack of donor support, and also World Bank attempts to undermine the universal pension in research reports which go into newspapers. I believe that the bank saw themselves as a kind of alternative government, and it was all quite shocking. I'd add to this, to the story of why poverty targeting isn't better than nothing. But I think poverty targeted programs can do real damage. Pre-civil war in Syria, there were all sorts of things going on. One of the things that was going on was a dramatic reduction in the universal fuel subsidy, encouraged by the IMF, which has since regretted it, I'm told. In place of the universal fuel subsidy came a very narrowly targeted cash transfer in compensation. And I do not think it did anything to help stabilise the situation. In fact, the evidence, again suggestive evidence, is that the opposite took place. And you can read about that in the book as well. There's a very good source on that. Someone that used to work within the senior level within the Syrian government. Why does the World Bank do all this? It seems so obviously wrong. What is going on? Well, I should say first, the World Bank has done good things on social protection. It was advocating for investment in social protection by donors and by governments. Before DFID was, where I used to work, it's been involved in collecting the evidence and promoting such social protection for well over 20 years, 25 years plus. I think it's misused some of the evidence, and I can give examples of that if people are interested, to support its own promotion of poverty targeting. But it does have that record. It's massively expanded its own financing of social protection programs, the staff working on social protection, and it's supported aspects of system building like digital, payment systems, etc. Now, whether it's doing more harm than good is a very live debate in my eyes, especially with the recent promotion of social registries, which I think is tipping the balance perhaps in the negative. Why is the World Bank doing what it does? I think, like donor organisations generally, staff have proven themselves more in the academic world more than in the government system building world. Now, there's nothing wrong with the academic world. It's very important. But government system building, I think, is a slightly different thing. Having worked for a few years on system building in the UK context, I know it's a much more practical thing where simplicity is key, doability. And I do, as well as obviously having sort of political impetus, I do think, and I say this about myself, having worked in DFID, donor staff think technically, much too technically rather than politically, and I'm sure Sam would agree from his experience of talking to donor staff like myself. There's an incentive to get very clever around the table, to come up with a clever wheeze, if you like, a program where you get short-term reductions in poverty, and you can talk about gender, and you can talk about economic empowerment, and you can talk about the climate crisis, and health and education and food security, all in one program. These are programs that certainly in the past enabled you to go up through the sort of approval layers within your organisation. But in the real world, what does our daughter Ella say? IRL in real life or something. What we're in danger of creating, what happens is you create a mess for governments because you're cutting across ministries. You're not encouraging the development of distinct government sectors and the development of government systems, in the case of social protection, that can deliver simple programs on a national scale. Why? Other reasons the World Bank does what it does. Well, speaking as an economist myself, a lot of economists work in the World Bank. Economists can be a bit arrogant, a bit subject to groupthink. No one wants to look foolish. There's a lack of encouraging critical thinking. It's a real problem. Of course, the World Bank has an incentive to agree loans from the World Bank to governments. And World Bank staff working within countries are hard pressed. There's no time to stand back and review the situation, so stuff gets pulled off the shelf that will go through the approval levels in Washington, and people look at what was done in other countries, what was done in the past, and so there's a sort of the momentum continues. There's obviously issues to do with power within the World Bank residing with the US and supporters of the US, which no doubt influences its ideology. And a note of sympathy for World Bank staff, there is pressure to deliver. I mean, they have corporate targets to get rid of extreme poverty within a certain time frame. I mean, who in human history has had that kind of sort of corporate target before? I mean, it's impossible. There's pressure on them to reduce poverty in the short term. Like there is pressure for all donors to show results from spending all this money. It was called the Results and Value for Money agenda when I worked in DFID about a decade ago, and it distorts things, frankly, makes you think short term instead of thinking longer term and more politically, which is where the big gains from investments are to be had. So what is the way forward? Well, the World Bank has to present evidence to countries objectively, more objectively. It has to encourage governments to step back and look at those pros and cons of different investment options. I mean, it sounds so obvious, but in my experience, the World Bank starts from a position of, well, it's obviously poverty targeting, and then it's just an issue of how to make it work. So the incentive system within the World Bank, or within parts of the World Bank at least, need to change, and countries that help to fund parts of IDA within the World Bank, money going mainly in loans to poorer countries, they have to press for reform. Problem is they're so entangled often with the World Bank to delivery. On delivery, this isn't happening as much as it should. It's basic aid effectiveness principles that were set out in the 2005 Paris Declaration on Aid Effectiveness that everyone in DFID used to talk about going back 20 years, but now it's been sidelined for one reason or another. I do wonder if one option is to set for donors for the World Bank to separate advice and money in some way, so there isn't this relentless focus on short-term results, short-term poverty results. I worked on general budget support in Uganda for a little while for DFID, and that's what that was basically. You transfer money to the exchequer, and you have a wider debate about government reform. Not easy, but perhaps possible. I mean, I do think the World Bank is the focus in this book because, I mean, it is the main focus when it comes to richer countries transferring to resources to poorer countries, which we have to think about. We have to think about. I know it's very much harder to do at the moment, but we have to think about it in the context of the climate crisis. But I think the World Bank in this sector has to change, or countries providing funding have to think of alternative routes to supporting lower income countries. I did a little book tour in Sweden in February. I sensed an appetite there for moving away from the World Bank. Even within the ministry, the Overseas Development Ministry there, it's quite interesting. But you know, we've got to be a bit careful. Transferring resources from wealthier to poorer countries isn't easy. Introducing, you know, all the appropriate safeguards. So there's got to be something better to replace the current system. But I want to sort of end on a sort of positive note. There is progress on social protection coverage globally, thanks to governments. It's now moved over 50% of the global population, though much less than that in poorer countries. And global campaigns to sort of push the World Bank to commit to universal social protection have been successful. The World Bank now has been, for a number of years, publicly committed to universal social protection. I mean, the problem is that they think of arguments why poverty targeting across the board is compatible with that. You know, we'll do this in the short term for universal social protection in the long term. It doesn't work for the reasons I've explained. Another reason for hope is I know there's quiet support amongst many people in the World Bank, many people working on social protection as well for messages in this book, but I mean they can't say it publicly. And we know more than 50 developing countries have introduced universal or near universal programs without donor support, sometimes in the face of donor opposition. So it's reassuring that the governments are the most important actors. It's just as well. The book describes governments fighting back in countries like Uganda, Nepal, Mauritius, Zanzibar, Kenya and Mongolia, and it's happening in many other countries as well. So this is a story of hope. Thank you.